Well, morality for me is about action. And I'm an existentialist in some sense, and what that means is that I believe that what people believe to be true is what they act out, not what they say. And so there's lots of definitions of truth. I mean, truth is a very expansive word, and you can think of objective truth. But behavioral truth isn't the same as objective truth. What you should do isn't the same as what is. As far as I can tell, people debate that, but I think the reason that that has to be the case is because, think about it this way. You're standing in front of a field, and you can see the field, but the field doesn't tell you how to walk through it. There's an infinite number of ways you could walk through it. And so you can't extract out an inviolable guide to how you should act from the array of facts that are in front of you, because there's just too many facts. And they don't have directionality. But you need to know. You need to know how not to suffer, and you need to know what your aim is. And so you have to overlay that objective reality with some interpretive structure. And it's the nature of that interpretive structure that we're going to be aiming at hard. I've given you some hints about it already. We've extracted it in part from observations of our own behavior and other people's behavior. And we've extracted it in part by the nature of our embodiment that's been shaped over hundreds of millions of years. But we see the infinite plane of facts, and we impose a moral interpretation on it. And the moral interpretation is what to do about what is. And that's associated both with security, because you just don't need too much complexity, and also with aim. And so we're mobile creatures, right? We need to know where we're going, because all we're ever concerned about, roughly speaking, is where we're going. That's what we need to know. Where are we going? What are we doing? And why? And that's not the same question as what is the world made of objectively. It's a different question, it requires different answers. And so that's the domain of the moral as far as I'm concerned, which is, well, what are you aiming at? And that's the question of the ultimate ideal in some sense. Even if you have trivial little, fragmentary ideals, there's something trying to emerge out of that that's more coherent and more integrated and more applicable and more practical. And that's the other thing, is that, you think about literature and you think about art and you think those aren't very tightly tied to the earth. They're Empyrean and airy and spiritual, and they don't seem practical, but I'm a practical person. And part of the reason that I want to assess these books from a literary and aesthetic and evolutionary perspective is to extract out something of value, something of real value that's practical. Something, because one of the rules that I have when I'm lecturing is that I don't want to tell anybody anything that they can't use, because I think of knowledge as a tool. It's something to implement in the world. We're tool-using creatures, and our knowledge is tools. And we need tools to work in the world. We need tools to regulate our emotions and to make things better and to put an end to suffering to the degree that we can, and to live with ourselves properly and to stand up properly. And you need the tools to do that. And so I don't want to do anything in this lecture series that isn't practical. I want you to come away having things put together in a way that you can immediately apply. I'm not interested in abstraction for the sake of abstraction. Rational, well, it's got to make sense, because the more restrictions on your theory, the better. And so I want it all laid out causally so that B follows A and B precedes C, and in a way that's understandable and doesn't require any unnecessary leap of faith. Because that's another thing that I think interferes with our relationship with a collection of books like the Bible, is that you're called upon to believe things that no one can believe. And that's no good, because that's a form of lie as far as I can tell. And then you have to scrap the whole thing, because in principle the whole thing's about truth. And if you have to start your pursuit of truth by swallowing a bunch of lies, then how in the world are you going to get anywhere with that? And so I don't want any uncertainty at the bottom of this, or I don't want any more than I can than I have to leave in it, because I can't get any farther than that. And so it's going to make sense rationally. I don't want it to be pushing up against what we know to be scientifically untrue, even though science is in flux, and that's, somewhat of a dangerous parameter. If it isn't working with evolutionary theory, for example, then I think that it's not a good enough solution. So, And then finally, it's phenomenological. Modern people, we think of reality as objective. And that's very powerful. But that isn't how we experience reality. We have our domain of experience, and this is a hard thing to get a grip on, even though it should be the most obvious thing. For the phenomenologists, everything that you experience is real. And so they're interested in the structure of your subjective experience. And you say, well, you have subjective experience, and you have subjective experience, and so do you. And there's commonalities across all of those. Like, for example, you're likely to experience the same set of emotions. We've been able to identify canonical emotions and canonical motivations. And without that, we couldn't even communicate, because you wouldn't know what the other person was like. You'd have to explain infinitely. There's nothing you could take for granted, but you can. And phenomenology is the fact that in the center of my vision, my hands are very clear, and then out in the periphery, they disappear. And phenomenology is the way things smell and the way things taste and the fact that they matter. And so you could say in some sense that phenomenology is the study of what matters rather than matter. And it's a given from the phenomenological perspective that things have meaning. And even if you're a rationalist, say, and a cynic and a nihilist, and you say, well, nothing has any meaning, you still run into the problem of pain, because pain undercuts your arguments and has a meaning. So there's no escaping from the meaning. You can pretty much demolish all the positive parts of it, but trying to think your way out of the negative parts, man, good luck with that, because that just doesn't work. So phenomenology is, and the Bible stories, and I think this is true of fiction in general, is phenomenological. And it concentrates on trying to elucidate the nature of human experience, and that is not the same as the objective world. But it's also a form of truth, because it is truth that you have a field of experience and that it has qualities. The question is, what are the qualities? Now, ancient representations of reality were sort of a weird meld of observable phenomena, things that we would consider objective facts, and subjective truth, the projection of subjective truth. And I'll show you, for example, I'll show you how the Mesopotamians viewed the world. They had a model. Basically, the world was a disc. If you go out in a field at night, what does the world look like? Well, it's a disc. It's got a dome on top of it. Well, that was basically the Mesopotamian view of the world, and the view of the world that the people who wrote the first stories in the Bible believed too. And on top of the dome there was water. Well, obviously, it's like it rains, right? Where does the water come from? Well, there's water around the dome. And then there's land, that's the disc, and then underneath that there's water. How do you know that? Well, drill. You'll hit water. Well, it's under the earth, obviously, because otherwise how would you hit the water? And then what's under that? There's fresh water. And then what's under that? Well, if you go to the edge of the disc, you hit the ocean. It's salt water. So it's a dome with water outside of it. And then it's a disc that the dome sits on. And then underneath that, there's fresh water. And then underneath that, there's salt water. And that was roughly the Mesopotamian world. And you see that's a mix of observation and imagination, right? Because that isn't the world, but it is the way the world appears. It's a perfectly believable cosmology. And the sun rises and the sun sets on that dome. It's not like the thing is bloody well spinning. Who would ever think that up? It's obviously the sun comes up and goes down and then travels underneath the world and comes back up again. There's nothing more self-evident than that. Well, that's that strange intermingling of subjective fantasy, let's say, right at the level of perception and actual observable phenomena. And a lot of the cosmology that's associated with the biblical stories is exactly like that. It's half psychology and half reality, although the psychological is real as well. So that, and to know that the biblical stories have a phenomenological truth is really worth knowing, because the poor fundamentalists, they're trying to cling to their moral structure, and I understand why. Because it does organize their societies and it organizes their psyche, so they've got something to cling to, but they don't have a very sophisticated idea of the complexity of what constitutes truth, and they try to gerrymander the biblical stories into the domain of scientific theory, promoting creationism, for example, as an alternative scientific theory. It's like that just isn't going to go anywhere, you know? Because the people who wrote these damn stories weren't scientists to begin with. There weren't any scientists back then. There's hardly any scientists now. You know, it's hard to think scientifically, man. It's like it takes a lot of training, and even scientists don't think scientifically once you get them out of the lab, and hardly even when they're in the lab. You know, you got to get peer reviewed and criticized, and like it's hard to think scientifically. So, and however the people who wrote these stories thought was more like dramatists think, more like Shakespeare thought, but that doesn't mean that there isn't truth in it. It just means that you have to be a little bit more sophisticated about your ideas of truth. And that's okay, you know. There are truths to live by. Okay, well, fine. Then we want to figure out what those are because we need to live and maybe not to suffer so much. So if you know that what the Bible stories and stories in general are trying to represent is the lived experience of conscious individuals, like the structure of the lived experience of conscious individuals, then that opens up the possibility of a whole different realm of understanding and eliminates the contradiction that's been painful for people between the objective world and let's say, the claims of religious stories.